creates massive resentment. That is why this movement, when it started, it was affecting middle class, upper middle class, and so on, because all of them are getting impoverished in this society at the moment.
Arwa Hassan, you've been looking at Egypt closely with Transparency International. And if we listen to what Hussam Abdullah has been saying about how far this corruption and bribery has filtered down, what is your assessment of how far it goes and how much the local population is affected by it?
Well, I think corruption by its nature tends to affect the very poor, and what the two other colleagues have been saying, in fact, completely reflects the findings of our study, and that there's a very serious conflict of interest problems. There's a very serious problem with the illicit enrichment. Egypt, for example, does have a law of illicit enrichment, but this needs to be amended. There's political interference in the work of anti-corruption agencies, so they're not able to carry out their function properly. Civil society is very limited, again, by Law 84, which some of your listeners may know, which very severely constricts the space for civil society organizations to operate. So on every level, in every aspect of daily life and in every aspect of society, we're seeing people suffering as a result of lack of transparency, a lack of integrity, and lack of accountability mechanisms.
Hussam Abdullah, moves have been made to hold people accountable, to hold some of these ministers accountable. Their assets have been frozen, they've been prevented from leaving the country. Do you think that this is a genuine move to clean up Egypt, or is this more a matter of making some scapegoats to quiet people on the streets?
It's a window dressing, really. Corruption is much wider, and there is quite a substantial number of people in power must be a part of the whole picture. And I personally believe that one of the reasons why there is this movement to resist that President Mubarak goes is exactly because they don't want to open a very wide investigation into the corruption of the whole families and their relationships. And what is currently happening on the political level, in my opinion, is an attempt to deflate the revolutionary sense in the society. So you try to manage, as even President Obama is suggesting, to manage the change. And by managing it, you make people, have said that, you make some changes like the president cannot stand again, as if this is a concession and his son wouldn't stand, and few other amendments in the Constitution. The substantial changes needed is actually to write a new constitution, to create a parliamentary democracy, to specify the period in which people can stay in power, and to increase the transparency. And this is not what is happening. They are not even negotiating with the real powers in the street. The real power in the streets are the youth who have started this revolution and who have affected the massive number of the people to go out. They're talking to them in a patronizing fashion rather than a real way. And they are getting a lot of opposition parties which are meaningless in their presence. They were part of the system that the people have revolted against. So because of that, I really believe it's a window dressing. And there is a need for a continued pressure on the government and the army to effect a real change in the society.
Ibrahim Hayat, there are some attempts, as we're talking about, being made to call these ministers that have amassed fortunes to task. But we're talking to the tune of billions of dollars that these people have managed to make over the past few decades. What kind of an impact has that had on the economy, the fact that this money didn't actually filter down to the people?
I think it's too early now to talk about the economy, if we would like to change the economy one day. We have still to put in place a political process. And this is a matter of disagreement and violence between the two main groups. One is controlling the street, and the other one is controlling the security apparatus. But I would like to go back to one point that has been you mentioned earlier, which is the impact on people's lives. I believe the corruption, it comes from the biggest priest in this temple of corruption, which is Mr. Mubarak himself. Mr. Mubarak came, he was surrounded by his inner circle. He came after an assassination. So he was surrounded by a group of his own cronies who used to work with him in the aviation and the Air Force. And also what happened is that Bob Woodward has mentioned before in his book, The Hijab, that Hussein Salim, the guy who was in charge of Sharm el-Sheikh and the export of gas to Israel, this man, he was one of the secret frontmen of President Mubarak. He was, as mentioned in the book, the Hijab, the book, he was saying, he created a company called, in France, called the White Ales. And this one, this company had 4 partners: Mubarak, Hussein Salim, and Munir Thabit, who is Suzanne Mubarak's brother, and Mushir Ghazala, who was the Minister of Defense at that time. When Sadat was there, Mubarak was involved in corruption. This company was buying arms for Egypt, and it had a lot of problems with the law in the United States in 1981, and Hussein Salim protected Mubarak. And after that, it continued. Now what happened is, when you have the security apparatus taking control, this is what we call the old guard, which is now still in place, Omar Suleiman and all the other corrupted. And some others from the new guard, which is represented by Jamal Mubarak, who entered in force to the power after '99, and who brought with him all this new breed of greedy, shameless businessmen who wanted to grab everything and to use the privatization to deprive the poor citizens in Egypt from all the kind of services that were provided by the states before and the socialist regime earlier. So what happened now, when you take all this money, the country is not providing, is not financing all the services to different sectors. You know how many people are jobless in Egypt now? Officially, it's around 2.5, but I think formally it must be around 5. Next year we are expecting more than 7.8, this is official, million jobless people who will be unemployed in Egypt in 2012. We have in Egypt, this is a traditional country, we're talking about the family as the main cell, 13.4 million adults, which is around 40% of the adults who cannot get married. And this is a very traditional society with all the religious background. In Egypt, it has the highest rate in the whole world of divorce. We have around 600,000 kids who are taken care by institutions because no families can afford to keep them. We have millions who are living in the cemeteries. This is the services have degraded so deeply in Egypt. 45% live with less than $2 when we talk about ministers who have used the power to access to wealth. But also these people are also front men for the Suzanne Mubarak, for President Mubarak, for his son Jamal, for his son Ala, and all the other cronies. When we mention these figures, imagine if someone has 1 billion or 2 billion, how much money has he made to his own boss? Whether Anas al-Fuqi, who is the Minister of Information, nobody is talking about him, he's ruling a 42,000 empire of employees empire in the Ministry of Information. And all the other ones who are still there. Mubarak has had a habit before when he started talking about democracy. He said, I'm like a pharaoh. And what he did, all the other guys, you want to criticize the government, the prime minister, ministers, you do it. These are my employees. You don't like them? Put them in jail. I will fire them, etc. Now he's doing the same thing.
Okay, what is emerging is a very clear picture of money that is concentrated, very concentrated towards the political elite, and very little of it filtering down to the general population. But what is also clear is that corruption is a well-known fact in Egypt, and it does happen, and it's quite widespread. So Arwa Hassan, I want to ask you, many Western governments have always condemned corruption. They often said that they will not deal with corrupt governments. But if you look at the U.S. government and the EU, they have very willingly worked with Egypt. Why haven't they put more pressure on Egypt to clean up?
Well, I think there are a variety of factors, really. And I think that, USAID, which is the U.S. government's development agency, has been trying to implement various programs in Egypt. I think, though, that it's actually very difficult to achieve real change because you're always going to come up against some kind of bottleneck. And I think this was what was happening. I previously gave the example of civil society. Now, civil society organizations and NGOs in Egypt could be arrested or imprisoned just for having a contact with a foreign entity. and that can mean just even receiving publications from a fellow NGO abroad. For receiving public funds, activists could be locked up. So for things that would not be considered offences. So what I think people need to realise is even those activists, even those people that perhaps belong to the intellectual elite and that were trying to achieve change, were quite constrained by the environment in which they were operating. Again, we